Hello and good afternoon from New York. Thank you all for joining the winter session of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Knowledge Against Violence speaker series, Understanding the Drivers of Violent Extremism in Africa. My name is Nieleti Hanwana. I'm a program officer at HFG. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation examines enduring and urgent problems of violence. We do this through basic and applied research. We aim to really understand the causes, manifestation, and control of violence. And we spread this knowledge to inform policy, practice, and public discourse, and to advance scholarship. Drawing from the Foundation's vast pool of scholars, fellows, and grantees, HFG convenes the speaker series to discuss timely research and analysis of situations of violence, including war, crime, terrorism, intimate relationships, climate instability, and political extremism. Our hope is that this informative space leads to knowledge sharing, and we therefore encourage you to post questions, comments, or relevant resources through the Zoom chat and Q&A functions. At this time, I'll invite our panelists to go ahead and turn on their videos while keeping themselves muted. Our session today will include a panel discussion between myself and our panelists, Daniela Biboa and Rachel Sweet. This will be followed by a question and answer exchange with the audience. And should you have questions or comments, please do share them with our speakers. You can submit them using the Q&A function along the bottom of the Zoom screen. My colleagues Liza Hogan and Ellie Shackleton and I will be collecting your questions, and they'll be posed to our speakers during the Q&A portion of today's session. Without further ado, I'll briefly introduce our two speakers today. Daniel Agbiboa is Assistant Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Before joining the Harvard faculty, he was Assistant Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University's Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. He was a postdoctoral fellow from 2016 to 2017 at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House under the research theme Global Shifts, Urbanization, Migration, and Climate Change. Professor Agbiboa earned a PhD in International Development from the University of Oxford at St. Anthony's College as a Queen Elizabeth House Scholar and an MPhil in Developmental Studies from the University of Cambridge as a Cecil Renaud Scholar. He received a Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Distinguished Scholar Award in 2017. Daniel, thank you for joining us. Rachel Sweet is an Assistant Professor of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She is a core faculty member of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Koff School of Global Affairs. She also is a concurrent faculty member with the Department of Political Science. She has worked with the United Nations Office of the Secretary General, Special Envoy to the African Great Lakes as an armed group expert and as a conflict expert with the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission, and as a lead conflict investigator with the Congo Research Group and the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. She completed her PhD at Northwestern University and received her Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Emerging Scholar Award in 2015. Benedito Machava, unfortunately, is not able to join us today, but I'm sure we'll have an engaging and spirited discussion with both Rachel and Daniel. So before we enter the moderated portion of our discussion, we thought it important just to set the scene a little bit about what the conversation today will entail, the realities as we understand them on the ground for countering violent extremism in Africa and ISIS-alleged violent extremism. And what you'll find from this conversation is that we're also going to be questioning and I think complicating some of the established dominant narratives that come, predominantly sort of from the from international efforts to counter violent extremism on the continent. Now, the dominant understandings of ISIS cells or ISIS-alleged cells operating on the continent include some 6,000 fighters. They talk about how those cells have been most active in the Sahel region, in the Horn of Africa, in Central Africa, and then most recently on the continent's southeastern Swahili coast. Insurgents are capturing strategic territories. They formed temporary alliances with ethnic militias. They talk about sort of conscripting child soldiers and using anti-government propaganda to recruit followers, especially among Africa's large population of unemployed and disaffected youths. Some of what both Rachel and Daniel have seen, however, does complicate this picture and this narrative some. There have been 3 sort of significant provinces that have been most closely attributed to ISIS-alleged violence. The Islamic State in West Africa province that operates in Nigeria, in Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, and Mali, the Islamic State Central Africa province, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mozambique, and the Islamic State Sinai province in Egypt. There have been other sort of attributed Islamic states in Algeria that also include and have been comprised of Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb former fighters. So extremists have seized strategic and resource-rich territories, including gold mining regions, areas with abundant natural gas, as we see in Mozambique. And as a result, Africa has been sort of termed the new front line in the war against jihadism. And of course, this creates dangerous economic, political, and security problems for the continent and for the wider world. However, again, as Rachel and Daniel will talk about in our moderated discussion, the ways in which the strategy has been implemented can definitely be problematized and complicated. And so the importance, I think, of bringing forth different and new types of research to shed some light on the policy implications and the ways in which we are creating narratives and eventually working to counter violent extremism on the continent will be central to our discussion. Finally, I do want to say that today we'll discuss some of the main drivers of ISIS-led, affiliated, or attributed or alleged violence. We'll be looking not only at the drivers of those who are carrying out this violence, we'll also be looking at the responses to this violence. We'll be interrogating understandings of vigilantism, of extremism itself, and most importantly, the role of the state and the understanding of how the state, the narrative, of the state really implicate how we understand the fight in this new frontier as it's been discussed. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into the moderated discussion. And I think I'll start, Rachel, perhaps with you. Your most recent work on the African continent has been in Congo. Could you outline ISIS DRC's activities in the region and talk specifically about the mass killings that you've been investigating?
Great, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I have been working in Eastern Congo, particularly in the location that is today known as Islamic State Central African Province since 2009. So I had the opportunity to do research and to live in this area before the violence now attributed to ISIS broke out. The key set of violence that we typically hear attributed to ISIS has to do with a series of mass killings that have been going on since 2014. In 2014, a series of killings broke out that used primarily machete attacks. This was a type of brutality that was unknown in this part of Eastern Congo. I'm going to be speaking specifically about the northern part of North Kivu territory, which is the place that ISIS DRC is allegedly has its headquarters. So since 2014, over 6,000 civilians have been killed and over 200,000 displaced as a result of this violence. When the killings first broke out in 2014, the core attribute of the violence was its uncertainty. When the killings broke out, civilians on the ground, the UN mission on the ground, had difficulty attributing the violence. They didn't know who was doing it or why. At that time in 2014, when the killings broke out, there were many different groups that were being cited within the UN intelligence mission on the ground, as well as through local authorities. These included a whole series of local militias. They included an armed group known as the Allied Democratic Forces, which today is known as ISIS DRC. They also included a range of political opposition groups as well. I just want to mention briefly some of the methodology that my team uses in order to investigate the killings, just because I think it's important when we're understanding some of the gaps between the rhetoric and what's going on the ground. So over the course of several years, beginning in 2015, I worked with a team of local experts, of Congolese experts with their own connections to armed groups and their own connections to the military. We were able to identify about 120 perpetrators or people who were directly linked to the killings. And we conducted in total about 400 interviews with perpetrators and with members of support networks linked to the killings. Because we went through a local ethnographic approach, we were able to identify some of the networks behind the killings. What we find is that when we compare some of the statements that our team was able to get, including from security officers, military professionals behind closed doors, and what is said to international public audiences, we find a startling divergence in the narratives around conflict. We compared what military officers in particular said behind closed doors to the press statements that they were giving on the international scale, and found that on the international scale, the military as well as the state in Congo represents the killings as attributable to an Islamic affiliated group at about 80% of the time. Behind closed doors, however, the actor that is most often implicated by the state and by military personnel are a combination of local authorities. These are local state officials as well as local chiefs, implicated about 70% of the time, as well as the military itself, including military organized squads at about 66% of the time. Just to zoom out, what this is initially telling us is that, first of all, there's a divergence between the narrative that's constructed and on-the-ground reality. What is visible tends to be visible for a reason. So information control is also part of the reality of the strategic use of violence in these areas. Second, it indicates that indeed, in Congo, as well as in many other areas, we need to approach the problem of the alleged ISIS DRC as one of organizing within a pre-existing protracted conflict, a conflict where for the 20 years before ISIS DRC allegedly came to the scene, there were previous armed groups, armed networks that never fully demobilized, armed networks that continue as parallel factions within the military, and a government and a military apparatus that is itself constructed of these parallel networks as well. So in order to understand the violence in this part of Congo, we need to understand the complex interrelationships and also some of the military, or some of the mafia rather, style infiltration between this. There have been consecutive investigative on the ground efforts that have all found dramatic support of different military factions for groups carrying out the killings as well. So this is a complex contemporary type of protracted war with multiple different factions that are all typically assigned under an umbrella of ISIS DRC, which is more of a concept and discourse than a social fact on the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel, for setting that scene for us. And if I could stay with you for a moment, part of what you talk about, I think, also lends itself to how we understand international involvement when you talk about countering violent extremism. I'm reminded, and unfortunately, Benedicto Machado will not be able to join us today, but as a Mozambican myself, I have been following the situation in Cabo Delgado in the north of Mozambique, where we've seen ISIS alleged and or affiliated violence over the last 5 years. It's displaced almost 1 million people and continues to spread through the country. And in the early years of this violence, there was a large debate about whether or not these were local armed groups, like you talk about in the Congolese example, armed groups that never fully disarmed, that had been active in different ways, but were now united under an ideological banner. And the response, right, the response from the international community varies greatly when you're talking about local-led violence versus violence that can be attributed to a larger ISIS state. So can you talk a little bit about, the contours of how violent extremism becomes countered when the dominant narrative is not linked to an ISIS state?
How to counter violent extremism when?
Well, sorry, let me be more clear, not how to counter it, but exactly the kinds of, the reasons why the state might attribute more violence to IS rather than these localized groups as you talk about.
So I think that what this case demonstrates is, again, first of all, the reality of protracted multiplayer war, where the security threat that we typically hear about is the one that's most visible, that most corresponds with foreign policy frames. Another key aspect of this is the complex interplay and the two-way relationship between the international system and how conflicts play out on the ground. So we typically think about mechanisms of the spread of radicalization in terms of foreign groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda entering an area and their ability to exploit pre-existing ethnic cleavages, pre-existing political cleavages in order to radicalize groups there and unite them under a single banner. What we find through more in-depth on the ground work is that there is a second trend that typically goes overlooked, which is the trend for local groups. And by local groups, I don't just mean like ethnic affiliated militias. I also mean transnational proxy groups that may have support from surrounding governments. I mean government-backed militias as well. So these are themselves somewhat sophisticated violent actors. But we also see the ability of these violent actors on the ground, these violent entrepreneurs, we could call them, to be able to use the foreign policy frames and apparatus in order to shine light on areas that benefit them and in order to conceal a whole host of other activities as well. So we've seen for several decades, in fact, groups around this area organizing under an umbrella of the ADF, which again was this like ISIS precursor group, if we can think of it in those terms. So for a few decades following the official transition to the post-conflict period within Congo, local armed groups, the political opposition, use the term ADF, which would be today like using the term ISIS to describe themselves as a way to elevate their threat profile, as a way to induce compliance, and a way to instill fear and terror among the local population. None of that had to do with any ideological commitments or ideological change. Many of these groups, in fact, when we found the main ISIS DRC camp, the main ADF camp in 2014 during a military operation, there were mosques in that camp. There was also a Christian church in that camp as well. So we find this like blending of ideologies, but the ability to instrumentalize certain policy frames for a whole host of other reasons as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for expanding on that. Daniel, we'll pivot to you for a moment. I mean, Boko Haram is perhaps one of the best known jihadist groups on the African continent, but your research has focused on responses to violence perpetrated by the group, and specifically around Nigerian youth-led vigilante groups. Could you further problematize for us this concept of youth as violent entrepreneurs?
Absolutely. Let me say I am delighted to be here and to be in this conversation. I think it's an important conversation, and I thank very much the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation for funding the research upon which I now draw. I want to say, yes, you're right. Boko Haram is one of the best known jihadi group, but I would argue it's also one of the least reported groups in the world, which is interesting. I want to piggyback on what Rachel is saying. I think three things I noted was how was the theme of the politics of knowledge, the legality of labels, and the politics of protection itself. And I think these politics of knowledge, of protection, and the danger of labeling and framing, I think culminate in the very notion of youth. I think it's a notion that increasingly has lost its analytical value, trapped in a sort of a colonial baggage of being reduced to the image of violent young men, and the emphasis is on men. And to the extent that women have sort of disappeared from the concept of youth in such a way then that young men is a synonym for youth, and youth itself is intrinsically is co-located or co-terminus with violence. And I think it's something that I've seen in my own work, in mostly in Nigeria, both in the Southwest and the Northeast, but extended now to the Lake Chad Basin more broadly. And it's a narrative that I wanted to question. And so the title of the project itself was Dying to Save. And it was a pushback against a narrative that typically frames young people as war machine. There are all this flowery language with which we call young people, lost generation, coming anarchy. These are the forte of predominantly Western scholars who work in these spaces. And I think they distort and they cause real violence, not just physical violence. I think they cause structural violence, spectral forms of violence. And I think the state rightly appropriates those discourse to reproduce its violent logic on the ground. So part of what I did was to look at the concept, to reclaim the concept of youth as not just violent entrepreneurs and actors, but people who are actually first and foremost against violence, people who are first and foremost looking to live their everyday lives, and people who are not necessarily in opposition to the state. Their hope is not against the state, but for the state, and to be part of the state security grid. So this is not the narrative of anti-state rebels, and this is not a dualistic conversation of rebel governance, good governance. This is really a more complicated, complex narrative. And what I want to do, let's say, if I may, is to use the case of Baga, a small fishing commercial settlement in the shores of Lake Chad Basin, to sort of complicate this story a bit. There was a massacre that took place in Baga in April 2013. Baga, home to 33,000 people. And the Nigerian Joint Task Force, which is the in charge of prosecuting the war against Boko Haram, having lost one of their members to Boko Haram, descended on Baga on April 16 and completely burnt down the town. You know, when the guns fell silent, when the dust settled, Baga residents accused the Nigerian security forces, not Boko Haram, of committing this violence. Of course, in their usual style, the Nigerian military, the Nigerian army pushed back, argued that anybody who says that the Nigerian security forces are abusive are actually Boko Haram themselves. Again, you see the way in which these labels are thrown around. But I think what happened, what I was more interested in is what happened in the wake of Baga. So scholars have long argued that state-led violence suddenly creates a system of anti-state reaction. So in the wake of violence, military violence, in the wake of 9/11, whatever, it creates this band of young Muslims with fire in their belly, ready to take on the state. But what happened next was not a group of young people against the state. It's a group of young people actually looking to reclaim, to repair the states, looking to voice their dissatisfaction within, not outside the frame of the state. And so the question that sort of underpins my research is really, how do we make sense of this? That is, how do we resolve this puzzle of victimized young people who are working with the same states that they routinely accuse of being violent towards them? And it doesn't satisfy to go to toe the line of the greed over grievance framework that has long dominated this space, the sense that these young people are driven by economic greed. And I sort of take that framework into the field, and it doesn't make sense to me when I think about the number of young youth vanguards, vigilantes, they call them various names. Again, that's another discussion for another day. Community militias, community defense groups, civilian defense groups. So young people who have emerged sometimes in the absence of the state, sometimes in the problematic presence of the state, to protect themselves and their community, and to do that alongside the state rather than against the state. And they are the many, not the few. Unfortunately, the sort of pathological public sphere and policy spheres always pushes us. We sort of live in this sort of necrocultural tradition of always looking at the violence rather than looking at young people who are actually against the violence. So I think what I was interested in is really trying to understand these young people who still hope for the state despite or even because of the violence of the state towards them. And so beyond the economic logic, I couldn't understand why young people would be in the front lines fighting and losing their lives. Sometimes, most times, their deaths are non-events. They are not even mentioned. They don't make it into, they are disputed, obviously part of the whole state's propaganda and framing. So what I have discovered in my research, analyzing the language, is to see ways in which these young people reproduce language of patriotism, language of community attachment, language of just love for their community and a desire to protect its values, its cultures, its traditions. I think that's something that is very hard for the international community to understand or to even accept. Just again, going back to the ontological connection of youth to young men and young men to violence. In a way that we've not only seen in Nigeria, that we've seen in the United States as well. With the Black Lives Matter movement and the ways in which, again, young men has become the figure of violence, entrenched by the war on drugs and the war on crime and what have you. But what you see as well is the NSAS movement against police brutality was also a display of young people not against the state. In fact, they were not calling for the end of policing, but for better salaries for police and for better working conditions. They were waving their national flag and singing the national anthem in what Kianga Yamata Taylor calls the festival of the oppressed, when they were shot down in cold blood by the Nigerian security forces. So again, you begin to see young people who are voicing, not exiting the state, even as the media, the international community focuses on the few who are exiting the state, whose exit from the state is actually a critique of the failings of the state, even though we don't accept their vision of what they put forward, which is essentially what Boko Haram is, following the death of the charismatic leader Mohammed Yusuf. So essentially, then there is an affective language. It's a language of patriotism, a language of love, a language of desire for the state that doesn't reflect in the narrative of youth dying to kill. That extends as well, that is gendered as well, because when women come into these dynamics, it's always about women who are used by men. And even when the literature tries to move beyond those types of narrative, it's always asserting the negative agency of women. The debate is about how women, it's actually not women who are used by men to commit suicide bombing. Women decide for themselves to go and kill. We never really change the focus into women who are actually using situated knowledge, using their intimate knowledge of physical and social space to counter violence. We never really shed the spotlight on women civil society groups that lead the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. They were at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter that constituted the very basis of what is called FEMCO that led the NSAS movement against police brutality. Again, we are not familiar with this kind of narrative of women because that is not the historically entrenched narrative of women who come into the literature as prostitutes, as people of easy virtue. And this is the kind of narrative that sort of this homogenizing narrative that unfortunately the international community works from. So this is how I understand the concept of how the very understanding how complicating the notion of youth can already begin to destabilize some of these grand narratives that are deeply problematic and do real structural violence to the lives and livelihoods of these people, because the state take this narrative and use them to do violence on their own people, on their own subject. So I'll say more about that, but I just wanted to, I guess, begin from that concept of youth.
Thank you. No, thank you so much for that, for unpacking that for us. And I think, as both of you have stated in this, just in these introductions, is the dominant narratives that we have are sort of multifaceted, right? There are dominant narratives about the violent extremism that we're seeing across the continent. There's dominant narratives about who's perpetrating that violence. And I think, Daniel, what you've brought in here are, the complexities about the dominant narratives of young people on the African continent, and broaden that out a little bit about the dominant narratives of young Black people, or young people of African descent, especially. And I want to stay on that point for just a moment, because what you've talked about is sort of state inclusion and the different ways in which the narrative around state inclusion can be used as a tool and exploited. Right. So on the one hand, there's, a literature that talks about how state exclusion has driven young people to radicalization, to joining these violent extremist groups, and that same, state exclusion, or the want to be included in the state, has also driven these young vigilantes. Would you talk a little bit more about, the state being used as a tool for these various, for these various actors?
Absolutely. I think the concept of state inclusion and exclusion has always underpinned discourse around youth as being the origins of state youth grievance, because they feel excluded from decision-making processes that affect their lives. They feel, if you're an urbanist, you talk about how young people feel that they are treated as undesirables and they are shunted to the margins of the city. I think as far as I see it, the question is not really a question of inclusion or exclusion. It's rather a question of, it's not that youth are excluded. It's the manner in which youth are included. It's the terms of their inclusion, the adverse incorporation of young people into the state in a way that does harm to them. And I'll think about, for example, the Boko Haram crisis itself was led by young people who were just trying to get by or make do, right? Their very form of livelihood, even as the state taxed them, unreceived taxes through extortion, their livelihood was never really considered in legal terms as a justified legal means of survival. In that way, then, they were being taxed at the same time that they were regarded, the law regarded them as disposable in such a way then that a police officer could kill a motorcycle driver without committing homicide. So it's really this sort of gray zone that they find themselves that has allowed for the violence that has happened. So in such a way then that these youth are not that they are excluded, is that they are included in certain ways that do violence to them. And that's really what is also happening with vigilante groups like the Civilian Joint Task Force. It's not that they are excluded. When I studied the Civilian Joint Task Force, on their shirt is their own badge, but also the badge of the Nigerian state. So there's that co-location. They are included. They talk about how they are given orientation, how they are how their own sectors are organized to fit military style sectors. So they speak the language of the state. But it's also the fact that these young people are left. The wages offered by the state is very selective. It's given to the few. They are given some equipment, but not enough. They're given some money, but not enough. So in essence, they live in what the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe talked about, in a state of injury. Theirs is not a case of life or death. It's a state of the in-between that has always characterized the way in which they come into these spaces. So I think the focus should move beyond inclusion and exclusion into the terms under which young people are included within the state. And the way in which those terms do violence, real violence to their lives and livelihoods in such a way then that when you peel open the youth-led vigilantes and Boko Haram, at the very core, these are young people who have been, who are caught between socioeconomic violence and caught between state violence, between Boko Haram and, if I may, government Haram. So this is at the core of what it means, the youth crisis. And they, whether it's Boko Haram, whether it's the Civilian Joint Task Force, whether it's the vigilante, they are offering a critique of a system that doesn't work for them. And then we can step back and say, no, this is not a viable critique of this is not a good vision. But in essence, then what you're saying is that the terms, we need to renegotiate the terms under which we are included here, because they are doing damage to us. And I think this is really what is going on in such a way then that young people want to work within the state to amplify their voice and to ensure that they can renegotiate the terms in their own to their own advantage.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And Rachel, I see you nodding your head, and I'm sure there's much that you would like to to add and to respond to what Daniel just outlined for us. I would, if you would do so, but also I'd like to come back to this point that you made, because both of what you've outlined here is sort of further complicating the role of the state. And Rachel, you talked specifically about how radical Islam is so often blamed for other political machinations. And I think a little bit of what Daniel just outlined, sort of government haram. I've never heard that before, and we'll use Chatham House rules here at HFG. But Rachel, if you would talk a little bit about those political machinations and in response to some of what Daniel has outlined.
Yeah, I think that there's two really core themes that intersect with Daniel's work and my own. One of them is the theme of voice, and whose voice are we listening to, both in terms of dominant discourse, as well as whose voice are we listening to about people on the ground who want inclusion and who have a very particular identification of security threats. So whose voice are we listening to? And the second key theme here is the politics of visibility and invisibility when it comes to the state as well. Just a bit on this question of voice. So in Eastern Congo, like in the case that Danielle is talking about, by and large, like, civilians accuse the state security forces of Congo for organizing the killings against them. This has been consistent since 2014. It continues today. When ISIS began claiming attacks, this claim started happening in 2018 after the caliphate in Iraq was defeated. And that type of claiming and rhetorical strategy was pretty similar to the strategy that Al-Qaeda took previously, when its back was against the wall, to allow other groups to use its name in order to have this global presence. But on the ground, community voices, civilians, people who have been directly attacked and who can recount the very specific details of attacks, tend to implicate the security forces. The security forces are, again, not one homogeneous group. They're themselves oftentimes this amalgam of competing factions. Some of them are linked with armed groups, including ones that would have claimed Islamist affiliation. But there's something really core at stake here about whose voice we're listening to when it comes to defining what the security threat is. I have had the experience, even just in the past months, of being in this place, which is called the Islamic State Central Africa Caliphate, and explaining to people asking them about ISIS on the ground. But by and large, people's response is, what is that? What does that mean? I've had no one who knows what ISIS is. So I've explained it to people. Some people will laugh in my face when I explain them what ISIS is and the ISIS spread. And they say, but like it's the military. That doesn't mean it's only state-led violence, but it does mean that this is so part of civilians' experiences that it's worthwhile listening to. The problem in Eastern Congo is typically portrayed as one of state absence. So when we read in the newspapers about this part of Congo, we read about the lawless jungles, we read about the state not being able to be present. The problem on the ground is not lack of state presence. It's highly militarized. The military is there on the ground. There's taxation structures there on the ground. The problem is that the state works for multiple different predatory ends. And similar to what Daniel is finding, civilians, including those who get recruited into the killing squads in this area, are largely not against the idea of the state. They wear their Congolese identity very proudly. The idea of being patriotic is core to their own identity, and it's something that they want to be able to claim for themselves. But the discourse is around a state that is predatory and a state that is undermining the community's well-being. I'd also just want to zoom out and to say within the broader arc of conflict in Congo, so within the past 20 years of war in Congo, there's been a successive pattern of rebel groups gaining territory. When rebel groups gain territory, they have almost universally taken over the state. That means that when there's a customs bureau or a tax bureau present, the armed groups take it over. They don't get rid of it, they just repurpose it. In a similar way, back during the Second Congo War in that 1998 to 2003 period, when armed groups took over, many of them put the national security forces on their payrolls. I know this because we have their internal records of the armed groups. We can look at the bureaucratic payments. So there's this broader, longer history of this hybrid constellation of the state and violent actors. This becomes part of the politics of visibility when it comes to how today on the ground in the ISIS DRC territory, people are able to talk or are policed about talking about what the source of violence is. By and large, the various constellation of groups involved in the killings typically don't want to advertise their presence and their involvement in the killings, in part because there's a backlash effect. There's fear that if people could identify them, the civilians would rise up against them. There's also then a fear of not being able to secure financial advantages that come with having a military or your faction sponsored by the international community. There's a very real threat of coercion about talking out loud about the sources of violence. People will say one thing in the public and say quite a different thing behind closed doors in confidence. What this means is that if we take the public statements, particularly some of the videos that circulate on social media, if we take some of those at face value, what we've then done is buy into the specific version of events that is validated by violent actors, that is able to circulate in public. And what we're doing is undermining the rest of the community voices, but also the perpetrators' voices, both on the rebel group front as well as in the military front, who behind closed doors discuss a much broader range of actors, very much of them that have very little to do with religious affiliation or with Islam at all. So one of the key implications can be playing into some of the violent actors' narratives if we're taking these accounts at face value.
Absolutely. And staying with you, Rachel, just for a moment, I know you've done work not only on the African continent, but you've also done some work in Iraq, and you found some really interesting comparisons there. Can you tell us about the ethnographic work that you've done there and how it compares to the findings that you've seen in Eastern DRC?
Yeah, thank you. Some of the similarities with Iraq were very unexpected. I didn't anticipate them going in. So in Iraq, similar to some of the work in DRC, in Iraq with some of my Iraqi collaborators taking the lead on this, we've observed a similar set of concerns that people living in areas most affected by violence tend to identify. In Iraq, and in the contested areas of Iraq, rather, that we work, which would be like Sinjar, Diyala, Hawija, and Mahmur, we typically find that communities will complain that what they read in the news, either national news or international news, often has very little to do with the on-the-ground dynamics of violence and the attacks that they see get played out in their daily life. So in Iraq, as well as in this part of Eastern Congo, that is the ISIS DRC territory, what we've done is to create a community reporting mechanism. So this differs from like an early warning mechanism of trying to predict whether violence will occur, rather when violence does occur. So when there is a bombing, when there is a massacre, when there is an attack that breaks out, what we find is that people who are direct firsthand observers of this typically tend to go to some of their trusted colleagues, to their family members, to their professors, to religious leaders, to local authorities, and tell them what they saw. So the project in Iraq, as well as in Congo and present day, provides documentation, human rights documentation abuse, like training tools to core community members who function as nodes in local trust network, so that when people observe attacks and are relating what they saw directly, that the community documenters can write this down and transmit it to us in a way that is safe, secure, and confidential. So this is an effort to try to document the direct observations that civilians have. When we do investigations, these are the types of like direct eyewitness accounts that are highly detailed, can talk in terms of linguistic profiles and the operational procedures of violence. These are the types of like high level testimonies that we typically search for on the investigative side. So we're creating this community reporting mechanism so that communities can document their own experiences, and then we analyze them in various ways to corroborate and triangulate across them. What we find in Iraq, the results are still very preliminary, but is a similar type of instrumentalization of certain armed factions or the portrait of certain armed factions over others in order to cover up a range of other violent actors that exist on the ground. We have had reports, for example, from coroners who will describe how an attack was like a local honor killing or a local revenge killing based on the particular ways that bodies were mutilated. And we have like military officers that confirm that, but when military officers give press statements, it's attributed to ISIS, and that ISIS attribution is typically what's picked up then in the international media and recirculated. And so across both these areas, we have an overinflation of certain types of violent actors and an underreporting of others. That is particularly, some of the parallels with Iraq and Congo are particularly interesting when it comes to taking a look at some of the government-backed Shia militias in Iraq. So this would be groups affiliated with the Hashid al-Shabi or the PMU units there. Many of the trafficking networks within Iraq and many of the would be controlled by these Shia-backed or Shia government-backed militias. If we take a close look at the organizational structures of them, we find a pretty similar type of infiltration and extortion of like urban sectors in a way that would look fairly similar to some other complex environments as well. For example, if we take a look at the public like procurement contracts within key cities in Iraq, many of the public funds are extorted by the government-backed like Hashid Shabi militias. And so there's this like undercurrent of a much more like contemporary type of mafia infiltration, organizational structure of violence. That structure of violence is difficult to observe, it's dangerous to observe, and so it typically doesn't get picked up on within national level or international reporting. And these are also the things that civilians on the ground would get killed if they were to be talking about an unveiling in a public forum. So some of what this means is that we have this instrumentalization cross-regionally of certain images of violence over others. That doesn't mean that ISIS isn't present in Iraq. It just means that it's part of a range of other actors, and those other actors benefit from using ISIS also as a cover to carry out their forms of violence. What it also means is that what's most visible in these areas, it differs systematically from what civilians and direct observers on the ground report.
Thank you for supplying us with that comparison. You know, in our conversation today, you know, you both have highlighted really some of the divergence with those dominant narratives that we discussed. I would like to bring in a little bit into the discussion the situation in Mozambique, right? Which you know, this sort of incursion into the south of the continent seems to have some different contours, some different undertones to what we see in the north and the center of the continent. And so, you know, I take, again, bringing in that example of Cabo Delgado over the last 5 years in Mozambique. I think what you see to an extent is the long view that's taken by the Islamic State or by ISIS affiliated or allegedly affiliated groups, right? Mozambique, just as a way of background, has been a country in which the Muslim population and the practice of Islam has been mixed with a number of local religions, and especially in the north, sort of the Makonde people have very much sort of had melding of ethnic and religious realities. What we saw in the early 2000s, sort of directly following the war on terror, so-called war on terror in the Middle East predominantly, was a new calling, or sort of a new, exactly that, a new calling to these, and I don't like the word moderate, but let's say, I'll have to use the word moderate as I can't find a better word at this time, but to those whose practice of their religion was seen as mixed or impure. And so what was happening in the north of Mozambique was that a lot of these populations were being called to Wahhabism, were being called to go to Libya, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to train and learn the true faith. And they were, you know, and the idea being that they would then come back to Southern Africa and spread this. And these are many of the young people who are now sort of being used in the violence that we see perpetrated along Cabo Delgado. And so given the sort of entrenchment that we see over decades in places like Mozambique, I wonder if both of you could speak to sort of the contours of how ISIS or ISIS affiliated groups have tried to engage on the continent. And as you say, Rachel, it's not to say, as you gave the example of Iraq, it's not to say that ISIS isn't there, but it's that it's perhaps the most visible. But in a situation like Mozambique, where we see and we can track this change over time in some of these populations, how do you sort of understand that change? And then a little further, sort of what are some of the policy implications for that? So maybe Daniel, I'll give you the question first, and then we'll go to Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. I think when it comes to the northeast of Nigeria and more broadly, the Lake Chad Basin. What has always struck me, and a lot of the time when I go into spaces, I do what is called a mobile ethnography. So I always believe that transport operators, mobile people have some of the best knowledge, best view of what's going on beyond the road. So I sort of go with these truck drivers who are navigating various spaces and talk to them. And one of the things that I've realized is that even in some of the supposedly most dangerous places to navigate in Northeast Nigeria, the concern of people is not so much a concern about Boko Haram or the Islamic State West African province or other armed opposition groups, as it is with the level of extortion that takes place at checkpoints. The way in which security forces appropriate this discourse, this coming anarchy of ISIS in African infiltration, the way in which they use that discourse to be able to tag certain people as Boko Haram, as ISIS affiliated, as these, or the threat of it to extort money from them. So the complaints were always remarkably about how somebody says, before I even change my gear and they use the manual form of driving, I encounter another checkpoint. How do I survive with that? So somebody talking about really feeling hurt by the fact that the security forces tend to call them Boko Haram in light of the amount of damage that Boko Haram has done to the community. So it's really interesting that, like Rachel was saying, the discourse on the ground, even in the local language, people are not talking about ISIS. So I don't know where this language is coming from, and we need to track this language. And that language is also a language that would have to take us to the doorstep of funding and funders. Who funds this project, and under what terms are this funding taking place? Because when I came in the last visit I did to my degree, the first thing that the driver said to me when I said I was a researcher, I said, look around, do you see any sort of people dying and bomb blast around? I don't know what narrative you guys are talking about there, but we're just fine here. Obviously, we don't want to romanticize what is going on, but it's important to track why is it there's a lot of contradictions and paradoxes that we have to elevate. For example, if there is across the spaces in which Rachel is working, across the case of Mozambique that you're getting, if the state is seen to be implicated by the vox populi, by the voice of the broader population in real violence, why does the state continue to be the default actor that we engage with? If historically you take the long durée of the fact that what we call the state has always been a pluralistic space that includes a range of actors, right? Operating according to a logic of conviviality, of complementarity, contestation. Why do we still take this sort of default narrative of a state that sort of stands apart from society? And when you talk about policy, for example, I work in a space where when people talk about community defense groups, when the question of policy comes out, the next thing that the policy recommendation that people get is these people need to be trained by who? The state. The state needs to train. The state that is implicated, as Rachel is saying, by most civilians in the terror is the one that is going to come in and do this training. The international community that understands the language of the local, but ignores it. I don't believe they are ignorant to that language, but I think certain conditions, one of which is funding, does not allow them to hear that language that is being spoken. And so the local people then say, okay, if it's money, then we're going to speak the language that you understand and get the money that you. So, which explains the discourse of the double narrative of one thing here, one thing there. These spaces are over researched, and so they are prepped. It's like giving a job talk. They know what to say when the international community come in and these NGOs come in, and then they get the money, and then well, that's what you want. So I think there are these they are awkward, uncomfortable truth that we need to get underneath and elevate and problematize why we keep engaging, beginning from a starting point that is problematic in many sense. So I think that's the sort of the divergence, to go back to where Rachel started from when she was talking about the divergence. That's the divergence where we're talking about one thing in conferences and community, but then at the everyday level, it seems to me that we miss almost entirely the immediate concern of people, which sometimes a concern about corruption, is a concern about not being allowed to use certain spaces. It's a concern, for example, the Boko Haram youth who were concerned that the ban on motorcycle helmet by the state in the name of this neoliberal world-class building, world-class cities and cleaning the city up has an impact not just on their religion, but has an impact on the fact that they cannot afford it. They just cannot afford to buy this motorcycle helmet. It obscures setting the underneath of things. For example, the fact that women are banned from using motorcycles because their husbands feel that they get too close to the young men who are riding them. Essentially, then these young men lose a key part of their customers, and then go up in arms in protest. It obscures some of these gendered, state-centric, neoliberal thing that is happening on the ground that sometimes get lost in the grammars of violent extremism that do a certain work. This grammar, the state itself has become very good at using this language in their own way to trap funding. Because when they label these groups, for example, hunters association groups that have been there for a long time, long before Boko Haram even came into existence, right? People talk about the civilian joint task force, but we have hunting associations that have always seen themselves as custodians of the bush, the Dozos, for example. And these have become conflated, and sometimes is the state itself conflating these narratives together to serve the interest of the international community, which then opens access to certain funding that allows it to perpetrate in that way, distorting the history of some of these groups. So, for example, the Al Majiri, the street children, who was Hannah Huetner, who's done work in this region, have been their own history of being seasonal migrants, of studying under Malam, has been distorted because now the narratives about how these street children are acting as a cannon fodder for Boko Haram and what have you, there's a panic around it, and the state has jumped into this bandwagon and have used it. And so what is just happening is not just a loss of life, it's a loss of history, a distortion of the history of these groups, and they need to disaggregate what we're talking about. We might be lost at the international level, but these groups are not lost. They understand their identity more often than on the role in society, and I think that's from a policy that, and this might not sound all at all policy, but I think if we approach, if you ask me about question of policy, what if we think about youth from a policy dimension, from a position of a hope for the state rather than a hope against the state? What kind of policies would we have if, for example, we think about community defense groups, not from a lens of groups who, oh, we need to do something about them, otherwise they are one day going to become the threat to our lives, when these young people have actually shown more often than not a willingness to die for the cause, sometimes with little or nothing. What kind of policies does that bring out for us? I think that's the kind of shift of lens, and once we have that, then the policy we will have is policies that work with rather than against the flows of these groups.
Yeah, Thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, absolutely.